Okay, so sorry, let me just move this Zoom thing. So in this talk, I'm shifting focus here from the fluid flow that we've seen in the previous talks to a deeper phenomenon, the ductile shear zones beneath strike slip faults and their interaction with earthquakes. So I'm going to first talk about observations of the interaction between earthquakes and bulk viscous deformation, and also grain size evolution shear zones. And then I'll describe how the model works. And then in the results section, I'll talk about first the simplest earthquake cycle model includes both spontaneously nucleating earthquakes and off-fault viscous deformation. And then I'll add grain size evolution and grain size sensitive deformation to that model. And then I'll discuss challenges that arise from the very long timescales of viscous deformation and grain size evolution, and present some preliminary results exploring the evolution of a fault in the shear zone system over a long time scale. And finally, I'll present some preliminary work on flash heating and viscoelastic cycle simulations. So microstructural evidence from exhumed faults and shear zones provide evidence that deformation style varies with depth in the lithosphere. Rocks exhumed from faults in the shallow crust sometimes show evidence that earthquakes occur in the form of pseudotachyllite. This is the picture in the upper left, which is a typically dark rock that appears glassy and very fine grained, and which forms during earthquake propagation when the earthquake generates enough heat to locally melt the rock. Exhumed rock from much deeper down can show evidence of viscous flow in the form of myelinite. This is the picture in the middle left. In comparison with an undeformed protoliths, as in the bottom left, myelinite shows evidence of flow and has a much smaller grain size. At these depths, the fault changes to a broader zone of more distributed deformation called a shear zone and is no longer capable of hosting earthquakes. And there's evidence that some rock has undergone both brittle deformation and ductile deformation successively, such as in this picture on the right of a pseudotachyllite which flowed and was then cross-cut by another pseudotachyllite, suggesting that the transition in these styles of deformation happens gradually and that earthquakes may be able to propagate from the seismogenic zone into the viscous regime. Chadzaras et al. 2020 found further evidence of the interaction between earthquakes and ductile deformation. They studied the Bogota Peninsula shear zone in New Caledonia, so that's in Southwest Pacific Ocean. And this is an exhumed mantle section of an oceanic transform zone. They observed the formation of fine-grained micro deformation zones that truncate and offset quartz or grains. They interpret these zones as resulting from zones of brittle deformation caused by earthquake fracture propagation downward into the upper mantle, which are then overprinted by ductile deformation. And when considering active faults, we can't access the microstructure at depth, but we are able to indirectly observe two important transitions, the lock to creeping transition on the fault and the brittle ductile transition. Both of these transitions constrain the down dip propagation limit of large earthquakes, and this down dip limit is one control on the maximum size earthquake that a fault is able to host. But in general, we lack a sufficient number of large earthquakes in a given region to extract that limit directly from observations, which is why we turn to other observations. So geodetic observations and microseismicity can both contribute to our understanding of the locked creeping transition in the BDT. For example, in the bottom left here, Hauxon and Meyer in 2019 compiled microseismicity data in different regions in Southern California and used the 95th percentile of the depth of microseismicity to measure the BDT. And on the right, Rolandone et al. In 2004 observed a rapid deepening followed by a more gradual shallowing of aftershocks after the 1992 Landers earthquake, which they identify as corresponding to a deepening and then shallowing of the BDT driven by strain rate dependent postseismic relaxation. And in this talk, I'm specifically focusing on the effect of grain size reduction and grain size sensitive rheology in a shear zone and how this changes the rheology, how this change in rheology affects the seismogenic zone. So shear zones are characterized by reduced grain size, and they may deform in part through grain size sensitive diffusion creep. Grain size evolution is the most widely preferred mechanism to explain shear zone localization and the changes in grain size and fabric commonly found in natural shear zones. And additionally, models that include grain size evolution can connect directly with microstructural data from exhumed shear zones. So first, I'm going to talk about how the model works here for viscoelastic earthquake cycles and how I model grain size evolution. I'm using my finite difference code cycle, and I model a vertical strike slip fault in 2D. I assume the off-fault material is symmetric around the fault, so I'm modeling only the right side of the domain with the fault acting as a left boundary condition. The fault is governed by rate and state friction, with the transition from velocity weakening to velocity strengthening behavior occurring in the mid-crust, and I put it at 350 degrees Celsius. It comes out to about 15 kilometers depth. In the off-fault material, there's a transition from effectively elastic behavior in the shallow crust, where the temperature is low, to ductile behavior in the lower crust or upper mantle once the temperature is sufficiently high. The brittle ductile transition doesn't necessarily occur at the same depth as the velocity weakening to velocity strengthening transition, and it's not imposed in the model, but rather evolves out of the solution of the governing equations. And I'm going to model the crust using rheological parameters for wet feldspar and the mantle with wet olivine. And finally, this model is loaded through the displacement of the left and right boundary conditions of the tectonic plate velocity, which for most of the results I'll show today is 35 millimeters per year or 10 to the minus 9 meters per second. In the off-fault material, two crystal plastic deformation mechanisms operate in parallel, dislocation creep and diffusion creep. The total viscous strain rate is the sum of the two, and the system will be dominated by whichever mechanism has the highest strain rate. Both mechanisms are thermally activated, hence the Arrhenius term they both have here. Dislocation creep is a nonlinear function of stress with a stress exponent of about 3. Diffusion creep has a stress exponent of 1, and it's grain size dependent. That's the D there is the grain size, with that exponent being around 3. The other parameters shown here, the prefactor A and the activation energy Q, depend upon the composition. At smaller grain sizes, diffusion creep will be the dominant deformation mechanism, and at larger grain sizes, dislocation creep is dominant. One approach to determining the grain size is to use the field boundary model proposed by DeBresser et al. In 1998, who argued that grain size reduction through dynamic recrystallization and grain growth will tend to balance each other out when the ratio of diffusion creep to dislocation creep is 1. Zhang and Seguia used this field boundary model to model the structure of a shear zone beneath an intracontinental strike-slip fault with a low tectonic loading rate of 0.5 millimeter per year. Here I've plotted their predictions of grain size on the left and total strain rate on the right, shown as a function of depth on the y-axis, distance from the fault on the x-axis. This model is symmetric around the fault, so I'm only showing results from one side. They predict that the BDT occurs at 18 kilometers depth, and that's shown with the dashed line. The ductile shear zone is highly localized at the BDT, and it broadens with depth. And the grain size is smallest in the middle of the shear zone at the depth of the BDT, where it's 215 microns, and it increases to be on the order of centimeters outside of the shear zone. To model grain size evolution, I'm using a slightly different model. I'm using the physics-based wattmeter developed by Austin and Evans in 2007, in which grain size increases through static grain growth, which is a thermally activated process. P is on the order of 3, so larger grains grow more slowly than smaller grains. And grain size is reduced by the fraction chi of the work done by dislocation creep, which goes into the formation of new grain surface area. I assume that 10% of the dislocation work contributes to grain size reduction, and the remainder is dissipated as heat. The wattmeter equation can be solved for the steady state grain size when static grain growth and grain size reduction balance each other out. Solving for the wattmeter's steady state grain size produces a piezometer-like relation. For a piezometer, the grain size is equal to the stress raised to a power n times a coefficient A. The wattmeter result has the same functional form, but the coefficient is temperature dependent, and the value for the stress exponent is a little different. For example, a TWIST 1977 piezometer for anorthite has a stress exponent of negative 1.47, whereas the wattmeter is about negative 1. On the right, I've plotted a deformation mechanism map for wet feldspar at lower crustal conditions. Here I've assumed 700 degrees Celsius. Here, so stress is on the x-axis and grain size in meters is on the y-axis. The red section is where grain size sensitive diffusion creep is the dominant mechanism, and the blue is where grain size insensitive dislocation creep is the dominant mechanism. So the purple line is the prediction of the twist piezometer. The green line is the Post and Tullis 1999 piezometer, and the black line is the wattmeter. All three predict that feldspar dominated shear zones will deform primarily through diffusion creep under these conditions. In comparison with the field boundary model, with the wattmeter, the ratio of the strain rates for diffusion creep and dislocation creep will not necessarily be 1 at steady state. Here I've solved for the temperature and stress dependence of this ratio, assuming steady state grain size. In these figures, stress is on the y-axis, temperature in Celsius is on the x-axis. And so the top row shows the magnitude of this ratio, with red indicating diffusion dominance and blue indicating dislocation dominance. The bottom row shows the grain size. Increasing temperature favors dislocation creep, while increasing stress favors diffusion creep. And increasing temperature or increasing stress both reduce the steady state grain size. So in the results, I'm going to first walk through a simple viscoelastic cycle simulation with only dislocation creep in the off-fault material. So this is the plot of the temporal evolution of the shear stress on the fault with the x-axis in years and the depth on the fault in y. So the discontinuities that you see are the earthquakes, which take place over about 30 seconds and are thus too brief to be visible in the plot, but their effect on the stress is clearly visible. So during the interseismic period, we have a stress concentration that builds up at the transition between velocity weakening and velocity strengthening portions of the fault. This concentration gradually builds in amplitude and moves up the fault until it nucleates an earthquake. But in this case, we actually get a slow slip event first, followed by an additional stress concentration that actually nucleates the large earthquake. And here in this top plot, I'm showing the evolution of slip velocity on the fault over time, white representing where the fault is slipping at exactly the loading velocity of 10 to the minus 9 meters per second, and dark blue indicating where the fault is effectively locked, such as in the upper portion of the crust. So the fault is creeping at approximately the tectonic plate velocity in this depth range here, and that's what's nucleating the earthquakes. And looking at this, you get the impression the fault is actually locked below about 22 kilometers depth, and that's not the case. What's actually happening here is that the off-fault material is much weaker than the frictional strength of the fault, and thus that's where bulk viscous deformation is occurring instead. These are snapshots of the accumulated viscous strain on the top row and viscous strain rate on the bottom row through one interseismic period. Again, this model is symmetric around the fault, so I'm showing cross sections of the right side of the domain. The viscous strain rate is elevated at the beginning of the interseismic period and gradually decreases through the interseismic period. The peak of the viscous strain occurs at the depth where the fault ceases to slip aseismically, in this example around 22 kilometers, and the shear zone widens beneath this point. And so here at the 1 year snapshot, you can see this region where the strain rate decreases before increasing again. That's because that's where I transitioned from feldspar in the crust to olivine in the mantle. Olivine at the same temperature is stronger than feldspar, so the peak strain rate in the mantle occurs deeper down where the temperatures are higher. This is a comparison between the viscoelastic cycle simulation on the bottom and the equivalent elastic cycle simulation on the top. The recurrence interval in both simulations is 270 years, and the earthquakes are the same size. So the difference in deformation in the lower crust between these two simulations did not produce a difference in behavior in the seismogenic zone. So in the next section, I'll include grain size evolution and diffusion creep in the model. And to focus on the interaction between the BDT and the seismogenic zone, I simplified the frictional parameters in this model to be only velocity weakening, and I neglected the effect of olivine in the mantle, focusing on only feldspar in the crust. So the top row shows the evolution of shear stress and slip velocity for this model with diffusion creep, in which diffusion creep is the dominant deformation mechanism. And in the bottom row is the same viscoelastic simulation with only dislocation creep included. So in the top row, the earthquakes are nucleating at a much, much shallower depth here, about 9 kilometers. And they also occur, or they're only able to propagate down also to 9.5 kilometers. And they're also occurring much more frequently. The recurrence interval is 135 years, whereas it's 270 years in the dislocation creep only model. So grain size reduction and a switch to diffusion creep is a powerful weakening mechanism and has shallowed the BDT by 13 kilometers. As a caveat, I did change the friction parameters between these two models, which is why there's a different amount of interseismic shallow fault slip here. But the major difference between these models comes from the switch to diffusion creep as the dominant mechanism. These are snapshots through one interseismic period of the evolution of grain size in the top row and deviatoric viscous strain rate on the bottom row. In this model, I only use wet feldspar rheological parameters, so there's no transition to olivine. The grain size is approximately constant in the mid crust, but it is reduced early in the post-seismic period here around 40 kilometers depth. And then here it increases in the interseismic period. And this is what results in the zone of elevated viscous strain rate at depth here. I found it very fruitful for these models to analyze the steady state approximation of the system in which the earthquakes are neglected and the fault slips steadily at tectonic loading velocity. Effectively, this is like averaging over the effects of the earthquakes. So I define steady state as when the elastic strain rates and hence the time derivative of the stresses are equal to 0. I combine these equations with the momentum balance equation to solve for steady state distributions of stresses, viscous strains, viscous strain rates, and grain size in the vicinity of a strike slip fault. It's much less computationally expensive to solve for the steady state of the system than it is to perform earthquake cycle simulations. And I found that some of the characteristics of the steady state solution are good predictions of the results that I see in an equivalent elastic cycle simulation. So I use this steady state approximation to quantify characteristics of the shear zone. Here I'm showing the steady state viscous strain rate on the left and grain size on the right for the cycle simulation with diffusion creep in the wattmeter to determine grain size. To facilitate comparison between simulation results and different types of observations, Laurent Montesi and I developed 3 quantitative definitions of a shear zone. First, the kinematic shear zone, shown in red, is the region in which the viscous strain rate is elevated above 100 times the background strain rate from tectonic loading, or 10 to the minus 13 inverse seconds. Second, the deformation zone, shown in yellow, is a measure of the degree of localization and is defined as the region within which 90% of total deformation occurs, both fault slip and distributed viscous strain. And third, the structural shear zone, shown in cyan, is the region within which the grain size is less than 50 microns, corresponding to the region within which myelinites might form. So again, these 3 definitions are quantifications of different aspects of the shear zone. The kinematic shear zone might be observable through surface velocity measurements, and the structural shear zone would be observed by field and lab work on an exhumed shear zone. This is a comparison of the shear zone structure in a simulation without grain size reduction on the left, so where dislocation creep is the only active mechanism, and then a simulation with grain size reduction on the right. So in this case, grain size reduction shallows the BDT by 13 kilometers, but it has very little effect on the shape and size of the kinematic shear zone and the deformation zone. This suggests that while grain size reduction and grain size sensitive flow can have a moderate localizing effect, it may not be powerful enough to produce a highly localized shear zone. And in this case, grain size reduction would be a consequence of localization, but not its cause. I also explored the effect of varying the tectonic plate velocity over an order of magnitude. So the figures on the right are the viscous strain rate and grain size for the high tectonic plate velocity of 10 to the minus 9 meters per second, comparable to the San Andreas Fault in Southern California. The figures on the left are for a lower tectonic plate velocity of 10 to the minus 10 meters per second, comparable to something like the Elsinore Fault. And these encompass the range of plausible strike slip fault velocities. What I find is that higher tectonic plate velocity leads to a higher strain rate, and this produces a deeper BDT and a deeper onset of the shear zone. It also decreases the grain size by about a factor of 2. If I scale the strain rate from each simulation by the loading strain rate, which is the tectonic plate velocity divided by the domain size, then the resulting scaled viscous strain rate is virtually identical between these two simulations. So the kinematic shear zone, the deformation zone, that's the yellow line and the red line, are insensitive to changes in the tectonic loading rate. To explore the effect of grain size reduction and diffusion creep on the depth of the BDT, I've performed a set of simulations varying the geotherm and the rheology. So on the x-axis here, I'm showing the surface heat flux with higher heat flux values corresponding to warmer geotherms. On the y-axis, I'm showing depth on the fault. I define the BDT as the depth range over which bulk viscous flow accommodates 10 to 90% of tectonic loading. And so the blue hatched area here shows the BDT depth for simulations with only dislocation creep and no grain size reduction. And the purple and red regions show the BDT depth for simulations with diffusion and dislocation creep operating in parallel. In the red region, the wattmeter determines the grain size, and in the purple region, the twist piezometer determines the grain size. Overall, this shows that grain size reduction and a switch to diffusion creep dominance, again, is a powerful weakening mechanism, and it can shallow the BDT by 10 to 20 kilometers, and that the wattmeter predicts the shallowest BDT. In my work on shear heating, I found that the steady state estimate of the BDT is a good predictor for the down dip limit of earthquake propagation. I did a couple cycle simulations to confirm that this still holds true with grain size reduction. So these two black dots indicate the down dip propagation limit of large earthquakes with the wattmeter for grain size evolution, so corresponding to that red hatched region. So the earthquakes are able to propagate a short distance below this BDT predicted by the steady state approximation, but it's a pretty close estimate. For a given rheology, temperature is the primary factor that controls the depth of the BDT, which can be seen in this plot on the right, in which the BDT occurs at a roughly constant temperature for each of these three rheologies. However, these rheologies are also strain rate dependent. So the hatched regions show the BDT for that tectonic plate velocity of 10 to the minus 9 meters per second, and the solid regions show the BDT depth for a tectonic plate velocity that's a factor of 10 slower, 10 to the minus 10 meters per second. This corresponds to a lower background strain rate and produces a shallower BDT at temperatures 20 to 40 degrees cooler. Finally, I'm going to talk about the characteristic timescales of viscoelastic deformation, shear heating, and grain size evolution. So in single dynamic rupture simulations, the nucleation of the earthquake is forced, a process sometimes called the hand of God. The stress state on the fault is also chosen by the modeler, and in contrast, earthquake cycle simulations have spontaneous nucleation and evolve self-consistent on and off fault stresses. One of the advantages of earthquake cycle modeling over models of single dynamic ruptures is that cycle models become self-consistent and independent of initial conditions. That's true for elastic simulations, at least, which typically evolve past their initial conditions after a brief spin-up period of just a few earthquake cycles or a few hundred years. This turns out not to be the case for viscoelastic simulations for reasons I'll go into at the end of the section, but first, I'll go into more depth about how to evaluate spin-up. So this is an example of an elastic spring slider model operating in a limit cycle shown in the phase diagram on the right. So the red and blue correspond to two different initial conditions. In both cases, the system quickly evolves to join the limit cycle. Again, one of the advantages of earthquake cycle simulation is that the system, once it's spun up, doesn't depend on the choice of initial conditions. So it's okay to make a somewhat poor guess for initial conditions as long as you have time to evolve the system until it becomes fully spun up. Spin-up is particularly simple to assess in this 1D case, but the phase diagram can be extended to illustrate a 2D simulation as well. I can create a similar phase diagram to the 1D case by integrating the slip velocity and shear stress on the fault. That's what I'm showing on the left here. I also scaled the shear stress by the normal stress to make the figure easier to read. So this shows that the simulation is repeating the same limit cycle with each earthquake moving clockwise on the plot, illustrating that it's fully spun up. And on the right, I've plotted two phase diagrams for two specific points on the fault without integrating along the fault. One at 10 kilometers depth, which is above the nucleation depth, and that's shown in red, and one below the nucleation depth at 20 kilometers, that's shown in purple. Neither of these points is going through the nucleation phase. The shape's a little different, but both of them are repeating the same cycle for each earthquake. And these points here where it gets a little messy, that's just because I didn't pull enough time steps to fully resolve that part of the phase. This system is fully spun up, it's operating in limit cycle, and it's repeating the same earthquake over and over. That's because I selected model parameters so that this simulation and the preceding 1D simulation would operate in this regime to make spin up particularly easy to evaluate. So I've played around with some different ways of illustrating spin up for viscoelastic simulations. It's possible to make the same diagram showing slip velocity and shear stress integrated along the fault, and that produces generally similar results to the elastic earthquake cycle. In this case, this viscoelastic simulation also has an additional feature in the interseismic period that's from a slow slip event. The elastic cycle also had some pulsing of the slip velocity in the interseismic period, but it's not substantial enough to be visible in the phase diagram. But this graph ignores anything that's happening with the viscous strains. And I think it's probably possible to integrate the strains or perhaps strain rates over the domain and include that in the diagram. So again, elastic cycle simulations spin up very quickly, but in contrast, the spin up time for viscoelastic cycle simulations on the order of millions of years. It scales with the Maxwell time, which is the ratio of the effective viscosity to the shear modulus, and it's the characteristic timescale for a viscoelastic material to respond to a change in the system. The Maxwell time ranges over hundreds to millions of years in the lower crust and upper mantle. And similarly, the timescale for diffusion of heat relevant for systems with shear heating is on the order of 10 million years, and the timescale for grain size that I've plotted on the right here is in the upper mantle, comparable to or shorter than the length of a typical interseismic period for large earthquakes, but in the lower crust, the timescale for this grain size evolution rivals the age of the universe. So unlike for elastic cycle simulations, these very long spin-up times reflect real physical processes and are comparable to or longer than the likely lifetime of strike-slip faults. Thus, this leads to the conclusion that fault and shear zone systems are probably not operating at steady state, and that to understand the fault and shear zone system, we need to move away from the assumption that the model is not sensitive to initial conditions. And we need to consider the effects of, as an example, inherited structure or perhaps non-steady state temperature profiles. So going forward, we as a community need to either push earthquake cycle simulations to much longer timescales or push geodynamic simulations down to much smaller timescales. As a first pass at such a simulation, I performed time-dependent simulations in which earthquakes are neglected and the fault slips aseismically at up to the tectonic loading velocity. And this model is focused on the crust, so I don't include a mantle in the model. So these are snapshots of the viscous strain rate on the top row, grain size on the bottom row at selected times. The initial conditions in the leftmost column are steady state stresses and strain rates consistent with a constant 1 millimeter grain size. The far right column shows the steady state structure that the system will eventually evolve toward. Under these conditions, dislocation creep is initially the dominant deformation mechanism, and appreciable viscous strain occurs only below 20 kilometers. Within the first year, grain size near the fault drops rapidly, where the work due to dislocation creep is the largest. This causes the dominant deformation mechanism to switch to diffusion creep within the shear zone. It also weakens the crust, causing a region of elevated viscous strain rate to form. Over the next 10,000 years, the shear zone, as defined by the viscous strain rate, slowly begins to localize. The layered grain size structure that's present far from the fault in the steady state, so that's out here, also develops, and that's contrary to my expectations going into this simulation. I thought only the grain size near the fault would experience enough viscous strain to meaningfully evolve, but that turns out not to be the case. And also using these simulation results, I can plot the evolution of the brittle ductile transition over time. So here the color plot is showing the evolution of shear stress on the fault over time. Time on the x-axis is in a log scale. And I've defined the BDT as the depth at which 90% of tectonic loading is accommodated by bulk viscous flow, because I found this is a good estimate of the down dip limit of coseismic slip for large earthquakes in my previous simulations. The evolution of the BDT over time is well fit by a line in log time. And I've plotted this line in cyan, and I've plotted the steady state BDT in orange. So extrapolating the cyan line predicts that steady state will be reached in 10 to the 11 years, which again is longer than the age of the universe. A young strike slip fault might be on the order of 1 million years old, and a mature strike slip fault more on the order of 20 to 30 million years. So this simulation without earthquakes provides an estimate for how the down dip limit of earthquakes might evolve with time. To explore how the earthquake size and recurrence interval changes as the system evolves, I'd like to do earthquake cycle simulations using time slices from this simulation as initial conditions. And that was an idealized model of a shear zone with initial conditions that aren't necessarily representative of the real Earth. I'm currently working on a project to model the evolution of the Morin shear zone in Quebec, Canada, with a group of geologists at University of Wisconsin-Madison and with Laurent Montesi at University of Maryland. The Morin shear zone formed under largely strike slip conditions, and it developed within the Morin anorthosite. So that's this purple region in the map, which is 85% or more plagioclase feldspar with minor pyroxene content. It displays a fabric gradient ranging from undeformed protolith to anorthositic myelinite, recording large shear strains. Preliminary fieldwork was performed in May, and master student Deanna Flores is working on analyzing the samples. They found that the shear zone appears as a set of anastomosing shear zones with a characteristic size of 1 meter. In my experience, simple models won't produce this kind of complex structure, so we're exploring to see if the presence of the stronger block to the east, this red region here, leads to increased localization in the weaker anorthosite. And finally, I'll talk about some models that I've done incorporating dynamic weakening mechanism of flash heating into viscoelastic cycle simulations. At low slip velocities, flash heating reduces the standard rate and state friction with the slip law. At high slip velocities, local temperature increases at asperity contacts, weaken the asperities, leading to a macroscopic drop in strength. Flash heating is one of a variety of dynamic weakening mechanisms which have been observed experimentally, and I'm including flash heating to capture these key effects of dynamic weakening. First, it reduces the coseismic frictional heat generation, and also it enables faults to operate at a lower background stress level, which reduces the cycle average thermal anomaly from frictional heat generation as well. It also enables earthquakes to propagate further into the velocity strengthening regions, potentially leading to much deeper down dip rupture propagation limits. And for the cycle simulations with flash heating I'm about to show, I use the simplified rate and state friction parameters shown in the figures on the right. So I'm using uniform velocity weakening parameters from 5 to 15 kilometers and uniform velocity strengthening parameters outside of this region, using the weakening velocity shown on the right figure. So flash heating will be able to operate over the entire velocity weakening region, but not outside of it. And I use a uniform effective normal stress of 50 megapascals. So in the elastic simulation, the inclusion of flash heating produced larger earthquakes that ruptured more of the domain, had longer recurrence intervals, and lower interseismic shear stress in the velocity weakening region that's never fully recovered through the interseismic period. And I was going to show results for a viscoelastic cycle simulation with flash heating, but unfortunately the computer that I used to perform these simulations was down for emergency maintenance last week, so I wasn't actually able to produce any graphs of this result. I'm also working with the PyLith team, in particular with Brad Agard, Matt Nepley, and Robert Walker to add earthquake cycles to PyLith. PyLith is an open source code that's widely used within the geophysics community. It can perform simulations in 3D with complex fault geometry and multiple faults. It also supports a variety of rheologies, including power law viscoelasticity. Right now, we're working to re-implement single dynamic ruptures in PyLith 3. We're working with a new formulation, which we expect will produce more rapid convergence than the formulation in PyLith 2. And once the single dynamic ruptures are working, then I'll implement earthquake cycles in PyLith 3. The implementation will support different discretizations in the coseismic and interseismic periods. So in conclusion, grain size evolution is a significant weakening mechanism, potentially shallowing the BDT by more than 10 kilometers. And to facilitate comparison with observations, we developed 3 definitions of a shear zone: the kinematic shear zone, deformation zone, and the structural shear zone. My results suggest that while grain size reduction and grain size sensitive flow can have a moderate localizing effect, it may not be powerful enough to produce a highly localized shear zone. And in this case, grain size reduction would be a consequence of localization, but not its cause. And finally, the stresses, viscous strain rates, and grain size in the vicinity of a fault may not be well represented by the assumption of steady state. The discrepancy between steady state and actual state is largest in the mid-crust, where relatively cool temperatures mean that the timescale of grain size evolution is very long. And at the same time, this region's proximity to the base of the fault means that it may have significant implications for earthquake cycle behavior.